Hi again, Kelly Ashby with Kelly Ashby Consulting. Today I'm going to be talking about the next nonprofit board best practice. So let me get my PowerPoint slide pulled up so that you can see as well as hear what I have to talk about today. So what we're going to be talking about today is that next piece as far as nonprofit board best practices. We're going to be talking about and focusing today on conflicts of interest and conflict of loyalty. So here's my short list of just some of them that I have other videos on. So if you're interested in these other topics, please take a look for these particular videos. But like I mentioned, today's topic, we're going to be focused on conflicts of interest and conflicts of loyalty. So some of you might be wondering, okay, what's the difference? Well, let me explain a couple of mistakes that are commonly made centered on conflicts of interest. Oftentimes, conflicts of interest, we narrow our definition to the legal definition, where it's just focused on an individual's personal financial benefit as far as being associated with the nonprofit or with a business that might benefit from the relationship. The other common mistake that's made is that we oftentimes leap to the assumption that any relationship at all is a conflict of interest. Well, that just simply isn't necessarily the case. So with conflicts of loyalty, this allows us to expand kind of our definition of what kinds of conflicts might bubble up as it relates to board members serving in multiple ways out in the community or in other businesses or other nonprofits, but also conflicts and the benefits that the nonprofit might have as a result of those relationships. So conflicts of loyalty include, let's say your board member is a board member on another nonprofit or even for-profit agency that serves the same population as your nonprofit. And let's say that particular person finds out about a great grant opportunity. Obviously, with you both, serving the same populations, that grant, you'd basically be competing with each other for access to those grant funds. Another example might be that that person meets somebody wonderful that would be a great addition to either board. Well, which board or which nonprofit does he share or introduce this great potential board member with? So it's important that we go through the processes of thinking through what other kinds of conflicts, such as these conflicts of interest, might bubble up unpredictably in some cases, and I'll go into that in the next slide. So what do we do about this? Well, one of the great approaches, if you will, to tackle this particular challenge is a three-dimensional approach. So most nonprofits have a process in place for handling that classic conflict of interest where there's a personal financial gain to be made by the board member. People will fill out disclosure forms that outline or list what other businesses and nonprofits they have relationships with, and when those kinds of topics come up at a board meeting and a decision is to be made, they excuse themselves from that discussion and the voting, obviously. So that's kind of your classic conflict of interest. And this is very important that your board makes this an annual practice that these kinds of things are disclosed. But let's talk about, again, expanding that definition and thinking about, okay, what are those ways that people might benefit, individuals or the nonprofit might benefit from the board members' relationship on your nonprofit board. So benefit from interest can be a good arrangement for either the nonprofit or the individual. An example of that, let's say a board member owns the office building downtown or somewhere and offers your nonprofit a discount for renting space in that particular building. Well, obviously that's a mutual beneficial situation for both the board member as well as the nonprofit board, but that could potentially be a problem. Another example, let's say that you have a parent on the board of a preschool where his or her, obviously preschooler attends school, and the discussion comes up that we're going to make a decision about raising tuition. Well, obviously that person is making a decision about a topic that impacts their finances individually at home with the tuition piece. Now, conflicts of loyalties come into play when perhaps your board member is serving on the board for the purpose of reporting back to an employer or an organization about what's going on. Well, certainly that reason for being involved may not be as altruistic as it should be. So if it's for the purpose of reporting back, then that might be a place to question, okay, where's your loyalty lie? Is it with the decisions and the good for the mission of this nonprofit, or is it with your employer organization that you're reporting back to? Another example of conflict of loyalties might come into play where, like I mentioned, the grant opportunity or the recruiting a new board member when you come across somebody that's really fantastic. So let's talk about some safeguards and we'll close this out. So first and foremost, obviously conflict of interest statements that are filled out and signed on an annual basis would be very important. And I would suggest expanding that to include conflict of loyalties as well. Posting information from number one in the board member roster. So oftentimes these pieces of information are just kept confidential so that only the chair of the board and the executive director know what has been disclosed. But why not have a more transparent process and post that information on the board member roster so that everybody is aware of those potential challenges that might be bubbling up? Really fits well with this next one. Make disclosure a normal practice. Make it transparent. Make it part of the process of the way you do business and function as a nonprofit board. Making sure people are clear about what kind of conflicts they may have, but also when you disclose it in a board member roster, others are aware too and may be able to point out, hey, this might be a potential conflict of interest or conflict of loyalty. And of course, anytime you are going to make a significant purchase, this is kind of common knowledge, I think, it would be wise to obtain competitive bids for any major purchases, maybe define that dollar amount for your nonprofit. If we're going to be making a purchase for products or services that meet or exceed this certain dollar amount, then we're going to put it out to bid. So it would be kind of a best practice. Let me take a look at my sheet. I gave you an example of how to vote on this, and I want to be able to make sure I include everything. So I'm going to read these. So I want you to give your nonprofit board a grade on how well they handle this conflict of interest. So give yourself an A, or thriving, if you have a clear written conflict of interest, benefit from interest, and conflict of loyalties policies and procedures for managing them, and that those policies and procedures are reviewed annually. Collect, obviously, those disclosure statements on an annual basis and make it part of the board roster. And finally, make sure that any board member that has a conflict of interest obviously abstains from voting. Give yourself a B, or healthy, if you have disclosure statements in place and are collected annually. You have conflict of interest policies, and those are written and followed. And anybody that has a conflict of interest obviously abstains from voting. Give yourself a C, or growing, if you have disclosure statements in place, but those disclosure statements tend to focus on only that classic type of conflict of interest, the personal financial gain only. And then finally, give yourself a D, messy, if you have no conflict of interest policies, no process outlined to guide the nonprofit on how to manage those conflicts, no disclosure statements, so on and so forth. So give yourself a grade, and if you need any help on how to improve on any of those particular items related to conflict of interest, conflict of loyalties, disclosure statements, how to manage things, give me a call. My contact information is on the slide. Thanks a lot and have a great day.